Your whole life has been a lie. Of course, if you clicked on this video, you probably already know this, or are at least starting to sense it. You live in the greatest nation on earth. You have it better than anyone in human history. Your ancestors were slaves and peasants, but not you. You're so special and privileged because modern society has blessed you with the gift of freedom. And all you have to do is work hard. Of course, these are all lies, and chances are you already know that. But you probably don't realize how big of a psyop this whole thing is, and just how much society has lied to you. These insidious lies have kept us manipulated and gaslit in an endless hamster wheel, where it feels like no matter what you do or how much you work, it's impossible to get ahead. But it's time you knew the truth. It's time we expose the wage slavery hamster wheel for exactly what it is. Let's take a moment to clearly define what the term wage slavery means. You've probably heard this term explode in popularity lately, but what exactly is it, and how does it differ from the traditional slavery we all know about? One key feature of any type of slavery is dependency. You are dependent on some sort of entity outside of yourself to survive. In traditional slavery, this meant being dependent on your lord or master. He owned your rights and provided your food and shelter, and thus your survival was completely dependent on him. Now, in the modern day, in order to keep up this facade of freedom, society has traded dependency on a lord or master for dependency on a wage. This is why the official definition of wage slavery is a person who is wholly dependent on income from employment, typically employment of an arduous or menial nature. What's crazy is that, at least from a financial perspective, you can easily make an argument that traditional slavery was even better than our modern form of wage slavery. And if you think I'm exaggerating, then consider this. We can all agree that with the sky-high cost of living today, modern dog-shit wages do not pay you enough to cover the expenses of rent and food. This isn't a remotely controversial statement that we can all agree on, right? Well, believe it or not, under traditional slavery, your slave master was expected to keep you properly housed and fed. In fact, there was actually good incentive to do so, as a slave who was well fed and properly taken care of could get a lot more work done than a slave who was starving. There are individual stories, anecdotes from all over the internet of people going homeless despite working 60 hours a week, people having to skip meals just to get by. And many times on this very channel, we've done the math, crunched the numbers, and have seen over and over again that working a full-time job is not enough to pay for food and rent anymore, something that traditional slave masters fully covered. Of course, if we're going to talk about other aspects outside of finances, historical slaves were obviously treated worse. We're at least not getting beaten and tortured, and we technically have rights. But just the fact that, financially speaking, we're actually worse off than traditional slaves speaks volume about how awful wages and employers are these days. Part 2. Why don't you just quit? So after pointing out all these facts, the common response I always see is, if it's that bad, why don't you just quit? I'm not going to lie. You have to be the most pompous, out of touch, rich asshole who lives in an alternate reality to ask this question. Over 80% of people hate their jobs. I can promise you it's not like they've just never thought about quitting before. If everyone had the true free will to just up and leave the awful jobs they hate, a lot more of them would. Just because we don't have a literal ball and chain to shackle slaves into place right now doesn't mean there aren't other methods of coercion that the ruling class uses. For example, we've all experienced the insane, rampant inflation and cost of living of the last few years. This is absolutely a modern form of a ball and chain, with how much it costs just to live, and wages that are not even close to keeping up. With over half of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, and one small, unexpected expense away from complete financial ruin. How are you ever going to save up enough money to quit your job? How are you ever going to save up enough to consider a career change if your boss is being an abusive jackass? How are you ever going to even consider owning a home or retiring? These are all the main reasons we supposedly have freedom, at least according to corporate shills. If you ever debate one of them on this issue, like I have many times, they'll tell you that even though we're forced to work, it's different from slavery because you can quit your job or change your job. But let's be honest here. Can you really? If you'll be kicked out of your house and starved to death if you say no, do you really have a choice here? Do you really have freedom here? Hopefully by now, you've seen through the matrix and why this whole illusion of freedom is a complete and total lie, as well as why they're so desperately and constantly trying to shove this freedom propaganda down our throats. As the French Revolution showed, once the slaves wake up and realize they're slaves, things can start to get very interesting. Part 3. The Hamster Wheel. One of the reasons I consider myself a philosophical gamer is that I actually learned a lot of valuable life lessons and philosophies from my own experiences playing video games. When I was a kid, RTS games like Age of Empires and Warcraft 3 were my favorite. Perhaps the most valuable lesson I learned from my RTS gaming experiences was that money is not the only valuable resource in life. For example, I used to always try and create the most expensive juggernaut units like war elephants in Age of Empires. My thinking was that since they cost a lot of money, they must be good. The problem was that my opponent could create 10 or 20 cheaper swordsmen in the time it took me to create one war elephant. From that point on, I learned the valuable lesson that time is more valuable than money, and I always lived that way. The funny thing was that even as a little child, I could see that the grown adults around me still hadn't learned that lesson. As typical boomers, they'd slave away for 10 hours a day at a job they hated for the money. Hey, at least they got paid some decent money, unlike us. Since time as a resource is far more valuable than money, this is a big reason why using hourly, time-based wages is such a powerful form of enslavement. And this is true no matter what the wage itself actually is. Whether you're getting paid $12, $15, $20 an hour or whatever, you're going to be confined in a physical workplace for over 8 hours per day. I actually wouldn't be so against work if it wasn't tied to your time. For example, if you had a set amount of work that had to be done during a day, and as soon as you finished, you were done. Or if you were paid based on your productivity. For example, if you were working at a McDonald's, being paid based on how many burgers you flipped rather than how many hours you worked. These types of work, though far from ideal, would be a lot more fair and tolerable. But that's exactly why they won't do it. By tying your labor to your time, they're able to keep you in this perpetual, endless hamster wheel loop of being enslaved to a corporation. Think about it. If let's say you were paid based on your productivity rather than your time, you'd actually be able to work harder, get more done, and eventually save up enough to quit. If you had a certain task you had to complete, but were free to go home once it was done, once again, you'd have a lot more time on your hands to start your own business, side hustles, or creative projects, and eventually save up enough money to quit. But by forcing you to trade your time for money, by forcing you to give up the much more valuable resource of time in exchange for the wages you need to survive, you're trapped in the hamster wheel of wage slaving for the illusion of freedom. Part 4. Sharecroppers. A lot of delusional boomers and corporate shills get insanely triggered and offended when you point out the facts and reality that working for an hourly wage is just a different form of slavery. They'll throw some tantrums about how it's historically insensitive to the plight of traditional slaves. They also seem to be unaware of the fact that labels are not always accurate. So let's go back to an era when slavery technically ended to see how ridiculous this logic is. Late 1800s, America. After the conclusion of the American Civil War with the North defeating the South and reuniting the country, slavery was technically and legally abolished. But let's be honest here. Did you really think the slave owners were going to just let go of their slaves that easily? Of course they weren't. And they came up with a very insidious, sinister economic model of exploitation that basically allowed them to continue owning slaves without actually calling it slavery: sharecropping. Here's a basic rundown of how sharecropping worked. After the conclusion of the Civil War, slave owners would take former slaves and force them into incredibly unfair and exploitative economic contracts. No, they didn't force them by beating them with a whip. That was already illegal. They forced them the same way society forces you to work for a wage. Hey, technically slavery ended, and you don't have to work for us if you don't want. It's just you'll go homeless and starve to death if you don't. Under these sharecropper contracts, former slaves had to go heavily into debt just to pay for work-related expenses that were non-negotiable and necessary for the job. They had to rent the land, the tools, and the seeds they needed to grow crops and farm. Slave owners knew this, and as a result, jacked up the prices of these work-related expenses to astronomical levels, so that sharecroppers would never be able to pay off the debt. And as a result, they had to work their entire lives. Now, if you're listening to this, I already know what you're thinking. This is pretty much exactly the system Gen Z has been forced into today. Gen Z has to go insanely into debt, paying for a car, to get to work, a college degree, all these BS certifications and qualifications they want you to get these days. These are all work-related expenses that you have to pay for in order to get a job. You basically just have to swap out renting out land and tools for college degrees and certifications, and just like that, you pretty much have the exact same work conditions that sharecroppers were forced into after the end of the Civil War. And just like the slave owners back then, today's slave owners are literally using the same exact excuses. Hey, technically you have rights. Hey, technically you can quit. Hey, technically no one's forcing you to work. It's just that if you don't, you'll go homeless and starve to death. And this is how we are lied to, manipulated, and gaslit into accepting this modern form of wage slavery under the guise and illusion of freedom. If you learn more about sharecropping, you'll see just how similar it is to our modern working conditions. We have a whole video that covers its entire history and how it eerily resembles modern-day working conditions that young people face today. Check it out right here.